Jennifer tore the wig off my wife's head, right in the middle of my son's wedding. Not in a quiet corner, not by accident, right there, in front of hundreds of guests, under the bright lights of that oceanfront estate in Charleston. She smiled, like she had just told a clever joke. The wig fell to the floor, and the woman standing there, frozen in front of everyone, was my wife, Mary, a woman who had spent the past 6 months fighting stage 3 cancer. The thing I remember most from that moment wasn't the laughter. It was my son's silence. Before I continue this story, if you're listening and you feel this is a story worth following, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I read those messages every evening. Now, for you to understand how things went this far, I have to go back a few hours, to the moment before we stepped onto that stage. I still remember how the room went quiet for a few seconds after that, not the kind of silence that comes from respect. It was the kind of silence you hear when people haven't decided yet, whether to keep laughing or pretend they didn't see anything. But my story doesn't begin at that moment. It started much earlier, that afternoon, when Mary and I walked into the oceanfront estate where Lucas's wedding was being held. The house stood right by the water. Tall glass doors opened out to the pale blue ocean of Charleston. Everything was decorated with imported white orchids. The tables were covered with thick linen cloths. Champagne was poured without pause, and the servers moved quietly, like they were afraid of disturbing the elegance in the air. I served in the military for nearly 40 years. I've stood in ceremonies far more formal than that. But somehow, standing in that room, I felt like an uninvited guest. Mary walked beside me. I could feel her hand resting lightly on my arm, not because she was weak, but because she needed a little balance. 6 months of treatment had made her body much thinner. The steps that once came quickly were now slower and careful. But Mary still stood straight. That morning she had spent nearly an hour in front of the small mirror in our hotel room, carefully adjusting her wig. "I don't want Lucas worrying about me on his wedding day," she told me, when I suggested we could sit toward the back. The wig was dark brown, neatly trimmed, almost identical to the hairstyle she had before the treatments began. If you only glanced at her, you wouldn't notice a thing. But I knew. I knew how many mornings she woke up early, just to make sure that wig sat perfectly in place. I knew she practiced walking through the hospital hallway, so she could keep her posture straight when standing in front of her son's guests. Mary had always been like that. She never liked troubling people with her own hardships. When we reached the seating area, a young woman holding a guest list looked up. She gave us a polite smile. "And you are—" "Harrison," I said, "the groom's father." Her smile paused for just a second before returning to its proper place. "Oh, of course." She led us to the front row, but the way she spoke made me feel like we were being seated out of formality, not because we truly belonged there. I looked around the room. Jennifer's family had arrived almost in full. Perfectly tailored suits, expensive watches, confident laughter, the kind that comes from people who feel like a place already belongs to them. Jennifer stood near the small stage where the ceremony would take place. She wore a white wedding dress so bright it almost reflected the lights above. When Lucas walked toward her, she placed her hand on his arm, like she was holding something valuable. Lucas saw us. For one brief second, his eyes stopped on Mary. Then he nodded. That was all. He didn't walk over. He didn't ask if his mother was feeling tired. He didn't say a single word. I said nothing. In the military, I learned that sometimes silence says more than any complaint ever could. Mary sat down beside me, her hands resting gently on her lap. "Beautiful," she whispered, looking out at the ocean through the glass. I knew she was trying to focus on the pleasant things. A group of women stood behind us talking. Their voices weren't quiet, and they didn't seem to care that we could hear them. "I heard the groom's mother was in the hospital recently." "Really?" "Yes. I think it's something serious. I don't understand why they still let her come here. Events like this aren't always appropriate." A soft laugh followed. I didn't turn around, but I recognized one of the voices. It was Jennifer's mother. Mary heard it too. I knew she did, because her hand tightened slightly. After a few seconds, she relaxed her fingers and gently adjusted her wig, as if it were nothing more than a habit. "I'm fine," she whispered. I nodded. Up front, Jennifer was speaking with a group of her friends. They kept glancing around the room, studying everything with the eyes of people used to showing off. One of them looked toward Mary. She leaned close and whispered something into Jennifer's ear. Jennifer turned her head. Her eyes stopped on Mary's hair. A little longer than necessary. Then she smiled. It wasn't a greeting. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they've just noticed a detail that might become a joke later. At that moment, I had no idea how far things would go. I only knew one thing. That afternoon, from the very first minutes, Mary and I were sitting at our own son's wedding, and yet somehow, it felt like we were sitting in someone else's house. I've been used to people's judging looks for a long time. In the military, people look at your uniform and decide who they think you are. At gatherings like this, they study your watch, your shoes, the way you stand in a room. But that day, the thing that caught my attention wasn't those looks. It was the way Lucas avoided looking directly at his mother. The ceremony began about 20 minutes later. Guests settled into their seats. Soft music drifted from a small band near the garden in the back. Everything had been arranged perfectly, like a photograph from a wedding magazine. Jennifer stepped to the beginning of the aisle. Lucas was already waiting at the front, beside the officiant. I glanced over at Mary. She was watching our son carefully, her eyes lighting up just a little. In that moment I saw again the woman I met 40 years ago, the one who always believed family was the most important thing in the world. The ceremony moved quickly. The vows were spoken. Guests applauded. Champagne glasses were filled again. After that, everyone moved toward the dinner reception. Round tables were arranged along the balcony, overlooking the ocean. The late afternoon sun reflected across the water, casting a soft, golden light, the kind of light that makes people think they're witnessing a perfect day. But I started noticing the small details. Jennifer and her family moved between the tables like the true hosts of the evening. They laughed loudly, shook hands with guests, told stories about business ventures and expensive trips. Lucas followed behind them, not like a son introducing his parents to the guests, but more like someone who had just been admitted into a private club and was trying to prove he belonged there. Almost no one spoke with Mary. A few people gave her polite nods, but most of the time they simply continued their conversations, as if she wasn't really there. Now and then, I saw Mary place her hand gently at her neck, adjusting the thin silk scarf and her wig, not because it was out of place, just a habit when she started feeling tired. "I'll go find Lucas," I whispered to her. Mary nodded. "Don't make things awkward for him today." That was always the way Mary thought, even when she was the one struggling, minute by minute, just to stay standing. I walked along the balcony until I saw Lucas near the bar with 3 of Jennifer's friends. They were laughing. One of the young men said something that made the whole group laugh even louder. "Lucas!" He turned when he heard my voice. "Dad." I stood beside him for a moment before speaking again. "Your mom's getting tired. You should sit with her for a while." Lucas glanced toward our table. Mary was sitting upright, both hands resting on the table, trying to look normal. He turned back to me. "Dad, there are a lot of important guests here today. She's your mother." Lucas let out a quiet breath. One of Jennifer's friends stepped in his voice, half joking. "Mr. Harrison, she looks fine to me. I think she's pretty strong." Another one added, lowering his voice, but not low enough. "Honestly, I'm a little surprised she even made it here. After everything, with the hospital." Lucas didn't argue. He just held his glass and looked down. In that moment, I understood that my son was trying to protect his place among these people. And sometimes, the easiest way to do that is to stay silent. I returned to our table. Mary was still sitting there, patient, as if nothing had changed. A little while later, Jennifer stood up near the front with a microphone. "Thank you all for coming today," she said, with a perfect smile. The guests applauded. "Family is very important to me." So, I thought it would be meaningful if Lucas's mother shared a few words. The whole room turned to look at our table. Mary paused slightly. I knew she hadn't prepared for that. We didn't even know there would be speeches. Jennifer continued, her voice gentle, but with something sharp beneath it. "I'm sure Mrs. Mary has many things she'd like to share." Mary looked at me. "I'm all right," she whispered softly. She stood up. Her steps were slow, but she kept her back straight as she walked toward the stage. I saw Jennifer tilt her head while watching her. Her eyes stopped on Mary's wig, once again. Then she spoke into the microphone, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Actually, I've always been curious. She gave a light laugh. I wonder, in this ocean breeze, does your hair get hot? A few people laughed. Small laughter, but clear enough. I felt my hand tighten around the edge of my chair. Mary kept walking. She didn't say a word, but at that moment, I began to understand that the evening wasn't going to stop with careless words. Mary kept walking toward the front, one step at a time, slow but steady. The stage lights fell across her pale blue dress, giving it a soft glow. If you didn't know the truth, you might have thought she was simply an older woman, walking up to give a few words at her son's wedding. But I knew how much effort it took for her, just to walk that short distance. The conversations around the tables slowly faded. A few guests turned their chairs to see better. Phones began to rise into the air the way they often do at elegant parties. People like to record everything. Mary stopped beside Jennifer. Jennifer handed her the microphone, but didn't step away. She stayed right there, leaning slightly as if she wanted a closer look. Mary held the microphone with both hands. For the first few seconds, she said nothing, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she was catching her breath. I saw her chest rise slowly. "Thank you all for coming today," Mary said. Her voice was a little softer than the music in the background, but the tables near the stage could hear her. "Lucas is my only son. I've always hoped a day like this would come." She paused for a moment. "And I hope the life ahead of you both will be peaceful." That was all. Mary never liked speaking in front of crowds. A few guests offered polite applause. Mary began to turn, ready to return to her table. That was when Jennifer stepped forward. "I think you should stay a little longer," she said, her voice still friendly. Mary stopped. Jennifer placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, as if holding her there for a congratulatory embrace. "It's really warm today," Jennifer said, glancing toward the nearby guests. "The ocean breeze is pretty strong, too." A few people chuckled softly. Jennifer lifted her hand toward Mary's hair, as though she were fixing a strand the wind had moved. "Let me help you with that." Everything happened very quickly. I saw Jennifer's hand grasp the hair at the back of Mary's head, a small tug, then a stronger pull. And in the next moment, the wig came free. It didn't fall to the floor right away. Jennifer was still holding it. The room fell into a strange kind of silence. The stage lights shone directly onto Mary's head, her bare scalp, the faint scars left from treatment, all of it suddenly visible beneath the bright lights, in front of hundreds of eyes. Mary stood perfectly still. Her hands remained gently in front of her, the way they had been when she held the microphone. She didn't reach for it. She didn't bow her head. She simply stood there. In the first few seconds, a few guests laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke. Jennifer laughed too. She lifted the wig slightly in her hand, like someone displaying an object that had just been discovered. "Oh," she said into the microphone, her voice light. "I didn't realize it would be that easy to take off." A few laughs came from her group of friends. Someone in the back even raised a phone higher, trying to capture the stage more clearly. I turned to look at Lucas. My son stood not far away, near Jennifer's family table. He had seen everything. I waited, just one step forward, just one simple movement, to stand beside his mother. But Lucas didn't move. He turned his head away, as if trying to avoid the eyes around him. Maybe he believed that if he didn't react, the moment would pass more quickly. Jennifer was still standing on the stage. Actually, she continued, her voice playful. Maybe this is more comfortable in weather like this. This time the laughter was louder. Mary still said nothing. She just stood there, under the lights, bareheaded before hundreds of guests. But the thing I remember most from that moment wasn't the laughter. It was Mary's eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. There was only one thing in her gaze. The silence of someone who had just realized that on her own son's wedding day, she had become the entertainment for the room. I stood up. The chair behind me slid slightly across the wooden floor. The sound wasn't loud, but in the growing silence of the room, it was enough for a few people to turn and look. I walked toward the stage, slowly, without rushing, because in that moment, I understood something very clearly. The evening was not going to end here. I stepped onto the stage while Jennifer was still standing there. Mary's wig still in her hand. No one stopped me. Maybe it was the way I walked. Slow, back straight, the same way I had walked down many long corridors during my years in the military. When I reached Mary, I didn't look at Jennifer right away. The first thing I did was take off my jacket. I placed it gently over Mary's shoulders, covering her bare head from the stage lights and from the phones that were still raised in the air. Mary turned her head slightly and looked at me. The calm in her eyes was still there, but I knew she was tired. Events like this demanded more from her than most people could see. "Shall we go home?" I asked quietly. Mary gave a small nod, but before we left, I turned and looked at the room. Hundreds of people were staring at the stage. Some of them were beginning to realize that what had just happened wasn't a joke. Jennifer was still standing beside us. Her smile was no longer as confident as it had been before. "I think people are misunderstanding," she said into the microphone, her voice a little stiff. I was only trying to help her feel more comfortable. No one laughed this time. I held out my hand. "Could you give me that, please?" I said. Jennifer looked down at the wig in her hand, then passed it to me. I placed it carefully on a nearby table. Then I turned back toward the guests. "I apologize for interrupting everyone's evening," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but the room had grown quiet enough for everyone to hear. I hadn't planned to say anything tonight. I believe my son's wedding day should belong to him. I paused. But sometimes, silence makes people think everything is acceptable. I looked toward Lucas. He was still standing near Jennifer's family table. His face was tense, but he hadn't stepped forward. "Lucas," I said. My son lifted his head. "I brought a wedding gift for you." From the inside pocket of my jacket, I took out a black envelope. It was something I had prepared months ago. I opened it and pulled out several documents. A few people in the front rows leaned forward to see. "In here," I said, "are the papers for a small house by the coast. The one your mother and I bought many years ago." I paused. "Along with a trust fund worth $5 million that we plan to transfer to you after the wedding." A low wave of whispers moved across the tables. Jennifer turned to look at Lucas. Lucas stepped forward. "Dad, this isn't—" I lifted my hand slightly, asking him to stop. "There's one more detail I brought with me tonight that many people here may not know." I looked around the room. This wedding is beautiful. Imported orchids, fine champagne, and a very impressive oceanfront estate. A few people began glancing toward Jennifer's family. "I've heard many people say that the bride's family arranged all of this." Jennifer straightened her posture. I shook my head slowly. "In fact, the cost of tonight's celebration came from a savings account." I turned toward Mary. "My wife's account." The air in the room shifted. Mary said nothing. She simply stood beside me, one hand holding the jacket around her shoulders. "For many years," I continued, "Mary saved small amounts whenever she could, not to impress anyone, only to make sure that when her son began his married life, he wouldn't have to start it under too much pressure." I looked toward Jennifer. Perhaps that made her wig seem out of place with the style of this evening. No one laughed. At one of the tables near the stage, I saw Jennifer's mother sitting straighter now, her expression no longer relaxed. I turned to Lucas again. "I brought these papers tonight to give to you after the ceremony." I held the documents in my hands. But there are moments in life that make a man reconsider. The room remained silent. I folded the papers and placed them back inside the envelope. "Lucas," I said slowly, "your mother spent months learning how to walk steadily again, just so she could stand here today." I turned my eyes toward Jennifer. "And you just turned that into entertainment." I paused. "So this gift will not be given tonight." Jennifer blinked. Lucas took another step forward. "Dad." I shook my head gently. "It's not because I want to punish anyone." I looked directly at my son. "It's simply because there are things in life that cannot be bought back once they're lost." In that room, for the first time since the evening began, no one said a word, and I knew that the elegant celebration had just changed completely. After I finished speaking, the room no longer felt like a wedding reception. The music had stopped at some point, though no one seemed to notice when. The champagne glasses on the tables were still full, but no one lifted them. Every eye in the room was fixed on the small stage where Mary and I were standing. Jennifer wasn't smiling anymore. Lucas took a few steps toward us, faster this time. "Dad, you can't do this here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We can talk about this privately later." I looked at my son. In that moment, I didn't see the little boy who used to run along the beach when he was 8 years old. I saw a grown man, worried about what the room had just heard. Mary touched my hand lightly. "That's enough," she said softly. "Let's go home." There was no blame in her voice. Mary never liked stretching out uncomfortable moments. I nodded. I picked up the envelope and stepped down from the stage with Mary. As we walked past the tables, many people avoided our eyes. A few others gave quiet nods, their silent way of showing respect. Lucas followed behind us. "Dad, please. Wait." We stopped near the balcony exit. Lucas stood in front of us, his breathing still quick. "I'm sorry," he said. "Jennifer, she was only joking." Everything got misunderstood. I didn't answer right away. I looked into his eyes, trying to find something familiar there. "Lucas," I said, slowly, "your mother stood under those lights alone." He said nothing. "No one asked you to argue with anyone, but if you had simply stepped forward and stood beside her, everything would have been different." Lucas lowered his head. After a moment, he said quietly, "I didn't think fast enough." Mary stepped forward. She placed her hand on Lucas's arm. "You don't need to explain anymore," she said. "Today should be a happy day for you." Lucas looked up. "Mom, Mary shook her head gently. "Some things in a family don't need many words." Her voice was as gentle as it had always been. But I knew Lucas understood. We left the estate as the sky outside was turning the soft orange color of sunset. No one tried to stop us. The ocean breeze in Charleston always feels cooler when the sun begins to sink. It carries the smell of salt and the steady rhythm of waves. Mary walked slowly down the small path that led to the sand behind the estate. I walked beside her. After a while, Mary stopped. She lifted a hand to her head and removed the small clip that had been holding the wig in place. I was still holding it in my hand. Mary smiled faintly as she looked out over the water. "Honestly, this feels better," she said. The ocean wind moved gently across her head, natural and quiet. No stage lights, no phones raised in the air, just the sound of the waves. We stood there for a long time without speaking. Finally, Mary turned to me. "Do you think we went too far?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. "No," I said. "We simply stopped at the right time." Mary nodded. In the distance, the lights from the estate were still glowing. The music had started again, very faint, as if the party was trying to continue. But for us, that evening was already over. I took Mary's hand as we began walking along the beach. Her steps were still slow, but steadier than they had been earlier that afternoon. After a while, Mary spoke quietly. "Lucas will understand." I looked out toward the horizon. "I hope so." Mary smiled. "Our son isn't a bad man." I knew she was right. Sometimes people simply lose their way for a while. We kept walking. The sun was nearly touching the water now, the last light of the day spreading a soft golden color across the sea. Mary squeezed my hand gently. "You know," she said, "hair isn't what makes a woman strong." I looked at her. "It's the way she stays standing, even when the whole room is watching." Mary laughed softly, and for the first time that long evening, I felt my heart grow a little lighter. We continued along the sand, leaving behind the bright estate and the stories people would be talking about for days. But for me, the most important thing about that night was very simple. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the money in the envelope. It was the fact that the woman who had walked beside me for 40 years was still holding my hand as we moved forward. If this story made you think for a moment about family respect and the things that truly matter in life, I hope you'll take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so others can hear the story as well. Sometimes the greatest lessons in life are very simple. True wealth isn't found in grand parties. It's found in how we treat the people who spent their lives sacrificing for us. If you believe gratitude and kindness in a family still matter, help this story reach others. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I wish you a peaceful and pleasant evening.